The cardboard-mounted photograph arrived at the Heritage School's archive on an unseasonably warm October afternoon, delivered by trembling hands that belonged to retired librarian Margaret Thornfield. What she carried had been discovered during the renovation of the old Millbrook Elementary School building, hidden behind a loose wall panel in what had once been the principal's office. The image would soon challenge everything that educational historian Dr. Jonathan Clark thought he understood about 19th-century school photography and record-keeping. Dr. Clark had been expecting Margaret's visit. Her phone call 3 days earlier had been brief but intriguing, mentioning only that she had found something during the school renovation that required his expertise. Margaret had worked as the head librarian at Millbrook Elementary for 37 years before retiring, and her dedication to preserving local educational history was well known throughout the district. When Margaret carefully unwrapped the photograph from its protective tissue paper, Dr. Clark found himself looking at what appeared to be a standard Victorian-era class portrait. The albumen print showed excellent preservation despite its age, with clear details that captured both the formal atmosphere of 1890s education and the individual personalities of the children it depicted. The photograph bore the photographer's stamp, Whitmore Studios, Boston, Massachusetts, May 1891. 32 children were arranged in 3 neat rows, with their teacher, a stern-looking woman in dark clothing, standing behind the group. The children's clothing and hairstyles were entirely consistent with the 1890s, and their serious expressions reflected the formal photographic conventions of the era. But Margaret's concern wasn't about the photograph's authenticity or condition. Her worry stemmed from something far more puzzling that she had discovered when she began researching the image's origins in preparation for a historical display about the school's past. Clark, Margaret said, settling into the chair across from his desk, I've spent weeks trying to identify every child in this photograph using the school records from 1891. I found attendance rolls, enrollment documents, and even parents' correspondence from that school year. Every child in this picture can be identified and matched to official records, with one exception. She pointed to the back row of the photograph, where a child sat among the other students in a position that should have made them clearly visible and easily identifiable. The child appeared to be approximately 10 or 11 years old, dressed in clothing similar to the other students, but there was something unsettling about their appearance that became more apparent under close examination. Margaret continued, explaining her meticulous research process. She had cross-referenced the 1891 school enrollment records with census data, birth certificates, and family genealogies to create comprehensive profiles of every student who should have been present for the class portrait. Her research had accounted for 32 children, exactly matching the number visible in the photograph. But when she had begun the process of identifying individual children by comparing their faces to family photographs and contemporary descriptions, she had discovered a disturbing discrepancy. 33 children were clearly visible in the class photograph, one more than could be accounted for through any official records. The extra child sat in the back row, positioned between 2 students who had been definitively identified through multiple sources. Unlike the other children in the photograph, whose faces showed the sharp clarity typical of professional Victorian photography, this child's features appeared strangely indistinct, as if they had been slightly out of focus during the exposure despite being positioned at the same distance from the camera as the surrounding students. Dr. Clark examined the photograph under magnification, immediately noticing the peculiar quality that had disturbed Margaret. The extra child's face showed a softness that contrasted sharply with the crisp details visible in the rest of the image. Their features seemed to blur into one another in a way that made precise identification impossible, yet their presence was unmistakably human rather than a photographic artifact or shadow. Most unsettling was the child's expression, which differed markedly from the serious but alert faces of their classmates. While the other children looked directly at the camera with the focused attention required by long exposure times, the extra child appeared to be looking slightly to the side, as if distracted by something outside the photographer's setup. Margaret, Dr. Clark said carefully, have you considered the possibility that there might be an error in the school records? Perhaps a child was enrolled but not properly documented, or maybe the official attendance figures were incomplete. Margaret had anticipated this question and had prepared comprehensive documentation to address it, She showed Dr. Clark copies of multiple record sources from 1891, including the teacher's daily attendance logs, the principal's enrollment reports, and the school board's official student counts. All sources consistently documented exactly 32 students in the class during the spring of 1891 when the photograph was taken. More significantly, Margaret had located the original invoice from Whitmore Studios for the class portrait session. The invoice, preserved in the school's financial records, specified photography services for 1 teacher and 32 pupils, confirming that the photographer had expected to document exactly the number of children accounted for in the official enrollment records. The invoice raised additional questions about how an extra child had appeared in the photograph without anyone noticing during the actual photography session. Victorian-era class portraits required careful positioning and extended exposure times, making it highly unlikely that an additional child could have joined the group without the teacher's knowledge or the photographer's awareness. Dr. Clark decided to investigate the broader context of Millbrook Elementary School in 1891, hoping to discover whether any unusual circumstances might explain the presence of an undocumented child in the class photograph. His research revealed that 1891 had been a challenging year for the school, marked by a scarlet fever outbreak that had affected several students and disrupted normal operations. The school records from that period contained references to children who had been absent for extended periods due to illness, and several students had been withdrawn from school permanently when their families moved away to escape the epidemic. Dr. Clark wondered whether the extra child might represent someone who had been connected to the school, but not formally enrolled during the spring photography session. However, his investigation of the scarlet fever outbreak records failed to identify any child who matched the appearance of the mysterious figure in the class photograph. The public health documents from 1891 provided detailed information about every child who had been affected by the epidemic, and none of their descriptions corresponded to the indistinct figure visible in the back row of the class portrait. Dr. Clark contacted Dr. Amanda Foster, a specialist in Victorian-era photography at the Museum of Fine Arts, requesting technical analysis of the Millbrook class photograph to determine whether the extra child could be explained through photographic anomalies or processing errors. Dr. Foster's expertise in albumen print photography made her uniquely qualified to assess whether the mysterious figure represented a genuine photographic subject or some form of technical artifact. Dr. Foster's preliminary examination confirmed that the photograph had been created using standard albumen print processes typical of professional portrait studios in the 1890s. The image showed no signs of double exposure, composite printing, or other manipulations that might have created the appearance of an additional figure. The extra child appeared to have been physically present during the photography session, captured through the same optical and chemical processes as the rest of the class. Most intriguingly, Dr. Foster's analysis revealed that the blurred appearance of the extra child's features was inconsistent with normal photographic blur caused by movement during exposure. The softness of the child's face followed patterns that suggested they had been less substantial or solid than the other students, allowing light to pass through or around them in ways that created the distinctive unfocused effect. This analysis raised the possibility that the extra child had been present during the photography session, but not entirely solid or opaque, existing in some intermediate state between full physical presence and complete absence. The photographic evidence suggested a phenomenon that exceeded conventional understanding of both photography and physical reality. Margaret had meanwhile continued her genealogical research, expanding her investigation beyond the official school records to include family histories, local newspaper archives, and cemetery records from the Millbrook area during the 1890s. Her goal was to identify any child who might have had connections to the school or community but had not been formally enrolled as a student. Her research had uncovered a tragic event that had occurred just weeks before the class photograph was taken. On April 3, 1891, a 10-year-old girl named Lucy Whitmore had drowned in the mill pond behind Millbrook Elementary School. Lucy had not been a student at the school, but she had lived in the neighborhood and had often played on the school grounds with children who did attend classes there. The newspaper accounts of Lucy's drowning described her as a lonely child whose family had recently moved to Millbrook from a rural area. She had been eager to make friends, and had frequently visited the school during recess periods, hoping to join the games and activities of the enrolled students. The teacher and principal had been aware of Lucy's presence, but had not allowed her to participate in formal school activities because she was not an official student. Lucy's death had deeply affected the Millbrook school community, with several students and teachers expressing guilt about not having been more welcoming to the isolated child. The school had held a memorial service for Lucy, and her parents had asked that she be remembered as part of the school community, even though she had never been formally enrolled. Margaret's discovery of Lucy Whitmore's story provided a potential identity for the extra child in the class photograph, but it also raised disturbing questions about how a child who had died weeks before the photography session could have appeared among the living students. The timing made it impossible for Lucy to have been physically present during the May 1891 class portrait, yet the photographic evidence seemed to suggest otherwise. Dr. Clark decided to investigate whether the Millbrook class photograph was unique or whether similar phenomena had been documented in other Victorian-era school photography. His research led him to contact archives and historical societies across New England, hoping to identify comparable cases of mysterious additional figures appearing in institutional group photographs. The response to his inquiries was both surprising and unsettling. Archives in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Vermont reported having similar photographs in their collections. School classes, church groups, and community organizations that showed extra individuals who could not be identified through contemporary records or documentation. The Concord Historical Society provided the most relevant comparison case, a school photograph from 1889 that showed an additional child standing behind the official class group. Like the Millbrook photograph, the mysterious figure appeared less distinct than the surrounding students and could not be matched to any enrollment records or family documentation from the period. According to the Concord records, that school had also experienced a tragedy shortly before their class photograph was taken. A student named Thomas Mitchell had died of pneumonia during the winter months, and several witnesses had reported seeing a child who resembled Thomas playing in the schoolyard after his death, though these sightings had been dismissed as grief-induced hallucinations. The pattern emerging from multiple archives suggested that Victorian-era school photography might have been particularly susceptible to capturing images of children who had died but maintained some connection to educational institutions they had attended or wanted to attend. The formal nature of school photography, combined with the emotional significance of educational environments for children, might have created conditions that enabled such manifestations. Dr. Foster expanded her technical analysis to include the comparative photographs that Dr. Clark had discovered, hoping to identify common characteristics that might explain how deceased children could appear in formal group portraits. Her analysis revealed consistent patterns across all the cases. The mysterious figures showed the same distinctive blurring effects, appeared less substantial than living subjects, and were positioned in ways that suggested awareness of the photography process, despite their ambiguous physical status. The consistency of these characteristics across multiple photographs and different photographers suggested that the phenomena represented genuine aspects of Victorian-era photography rather than isolated technical anomalies or processing errors. The cameras and chemical processes of the 1890s appeared to be capable of detecting and recording presences that were invisible or only partially visible to human observation. Margaret's research had meanwhile uncovered additional information about Lucy Whitmore's background and her connection to Millbrook Elementary School. Lucy's parents, immigrants from Ireland, had struggled financially and had been unable to afford the school fees required for formal enrollment. Lucy had desperately wanted to attend classes with the other neighborhood children, and her exclusion from school activities had been a source of significant emotional distress during the final months of her life. The school records contained several references to Lucy's attempts to participate in classroom activities, despite not being officially enrolled. Teachers had occasionally allowed her to sit in on lessons when her presence was discovered, but school policy had prevented her from becoming a full member of the student community she so desperately wanted to join. Lucy's drowning had occurred on a day when she had been particularly sad about missing school activities. According to witness accounts, she had been sitting alone by the mill pond, watching through the school windows as the other children participated in a spelling competition that she had not been allowed to join. The tragic circumstances of Lucy's exclusion from school life, followed by her death, and the subsequent guilt felt by the school community, had created emotional conditions that might have been conducive to her spiritual presence appearing in the class photograph. The formal class portrait represented exactly the type of school activity that Lucy had been denied during her life, making it symbolically significant as an opportunity for her to finally be included among her peers. Dr. Clark contacted Dr. Jennifer Morrison, a folklorist at Boston University, who specialized in 19th century beliefs about childhood death and spiritual presence. Dr. Morrison's research had documented widespread Victorian beliefs that children who died with unfulfilled desires or unresolved emotional connections could maintain spiritual presence in locations or communities that had been significant to them during life. According to Dr. Morrison's findings, schools had been particularly common locations for reported spiritual activity involving deceased children, especially when the children had been excluded from educational opportunities due to poverty, illness, or social circumstances. The Victorian era's emphasis on education as a pathway to social advancement had made school exclusion particularly traumatic for children and families who could not afford formal enrollment. The combination of Lucy Whitmore's desperate desire to attend school, her tragic death, and the guilt felt by the Millbrook school community had created psychological and emotional conditions that Victorian spiritualist beliefs would have considered highly conducive to ongoing spiritual presence. The class photograph might have provided an opportunity for Lucy's spirit to finally achieve the inclusion in school life that had been denied to her during her physical existence. Dr. Morrison's research also revealed that Victorian-era photography was widely believed to be capable of capturing spiritual presences that were invisible to normal human perception. Professional photographers of the period often reported unexpected figures appearing in their photographs, and some had developed specialized techniques for what was called spirit photography. The technical characteristics of albumin print photography, with its long exposure times and chemical sensitivity, had made Victorian cameras particularly suitable for detecting subtle visual phenomena that might be associated with spiritual presence. The photographic processes of the 1890s had involved extended interactions between light, chemistry, and time that created opportunities for capturing information that exceeded the capabilities of human vision. Dr. Clark's investigation had attracted attention from researchers in multiple disciplines, including photography historians, folklorists, and paranormal investigators who were interested in the implications of Victorian school photography for understanding the relationship between institutional environments, childhood trauma, and spiritual phenomena. The Millbrook class photograph had become part of a growing body of evidence, suggesting that Victorian-era institutional photography might have regularly documented spiritual presences associated with individuals who had been excluded, marginalized, or traumatized by their experiences with schools, churches, and community organizations. Margaret Thornfield had decided to create a permanent exhibit about Lucy Whitmore and the mysterious class photograph, hoping to honor the memory of a child whose desire for education had transcended the boundaries of life and death. The exhibit would acknowledge both the tragic circumstances of Lucy's exclusion from school life and the possibility that her spiritual presence had achieved the inclusion she had been denied during her physical existence. The research had revealed the importance of recognizing and addressing the emotional needs of children who were excluded from educational opportunities, whether due to economic circumstances, social discrimination, or other barriers that prevented them from participating fully in school communities. Lucy Whitmore's story served as a reminder that such exclusion could create lasting psychological and spiritual wounds that might persist beyond death. Dr. Foster's continuing analysis of Victorian spirit photography had revealed that schools, churches, and other community institutions frequently showed mysterious additional figures in their group photographs, suggesting that these environments were particularly conducive to spiritual manifestations associated with individuals who had been excluded or marginalized by institutional practices. The pattern of spiritual presence in institutional photography provided insights into the social dynamics of Victorian communities and the psychological impacts of exclusion and marginalization on children and families who could not afford full participation in community life. Contemporary applications of the research had begun to emerge in fields ranging from educational psychology to grief counseling. Understanding the long-term impacts of school exclusion on children's emotional and spiritual well-being had implications for modern educational practices and policies designed to ensure inclusive access to educational opportunities. The Millbrook class photograph continued to be studied by researchers investigating the relationship between photography, consciousness, and spiritual experience. The image had become an important example of how Victorian-era technology might have provided access to dimensions of reality that exceeded normal human perception. Lucy Whitmore's presence in the 1891 class photograph served as a powerful symbol of the desire for education and inclusion that could transcend any barrier, including death itself. Her blurred but unmistakable figure among the enrolled students represented both a tragedy of exclusion and a triumph of persistent spiritual connection to the educational community she had longed to join. The research had demonstrated that some aspects of human experience and desire were so fundamental that they could persist beyond physical death, manifesting in ways that could be detected through the sensitive technologies available during the Victorian era. The intersection of photographic chemistry, institutional environments, and human longing had created unique opportunities for documenting spiritual phenomena that challenged conventional understanding of consciousness and spiritual experience. As the investigation continued, Lucy Whitmore's story reminded researchers and educators that the desire for learning and community belonging represented essential human needs that demanded recognition and accommodation, and that the consequences of educational exclusion might extend far beyond the immediate impacts on individual children and families. The 1891 class photograph from Millbrook Elementary School had become more than a historical curiosity. It had evolved into a testament to the enduring power of human desire for education and inclusion, and a reminder that some connections to learning and community could persist in forms that exceeded the limitations of physical existence. Margaret Thornfield's dedication to preserving and understanding the photograph had helped reveal not only the identity of the mysterious extra child, but also the broader patterns of spiritual presence in Victorian institutional photography that documented the lasting impacts of social exclusion and the persistent human need for belonging and recognition within community institutions. The blurred figure of Lucy Whitmore continued to sit among her peers in the back row of the class photograph, finally achieving the inclusion in school life that had been denied to her during her brief physical existence. Her presence served as both a memorial to a tragic loss and a symbol of hope, that no child's desire for education and community belonging was ever truly forgotten or unfulfilled. Dr. Clark's research had established Victorian school photography as an important source of evidence for understanding both the social dynamics of 19th-century educational institutions and the spiritual dimensions of childhood experience that could persist beyond the boundaries of physical life. The investigation had revealed that some forms of human connection and desire were indeed strong enough to transcend any limitation, including the apparent finality of death. The extra child in the back row of the 1891 class photograph would forever serve as a reminder that educational communities had responsibilities that extended beyond their formal enrollment lists, and that the spiritual and emotional needs of all children, regardless of their official status, deserved recognition and accommodation within institutions dedicated to learning and human development. Lucy Whitmore's final achievement of her educational aspirations, documented through the mysterious capabilities of Victorian photography, provided evidence that the bonds between children and their learning communities could create connections that persisted across time, death, and the boundaries that seemed to separate the visible from the invisible dimensions of human experience. However, the investigation into Lucy Whitmore and the Millbrook class photograph was about to expand far beyond what anyone had anticipated. 6 months after Dr. Clark published his initial findings about the mysterious extra child, he began receiving correspondence from educators, historians, and archivists across the United States who had discovered similar phenomena in their own collections of historical school photography. The first major contact came from Dr. Helen Patterson, the chief archivist at the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History, who had been conducting a comprehensive review of their 19th century educational photography collection. Dr. Patterson had identified over 40 school photographs dating from the 1880s and 1890s that showed additional children who could not be accounted for through contemporary enrollment records or attendance documentation. Dr. Clark traveled to Washington to examine the Smithsonian's collection, bringing with him the advanced photographic analysis equipment that had proven so valuable in studying the Millbrook photograph. What he discovered in the National Archives would fundamentally transform his understanding of Victorian-era education and the spiritual dimensions of childhood exclusion from learning opportunities. The Smithsonian photographs revealed a pattern that was both heartbreaking and extraordinary. Nearly every mysterious additional child who appeared in school photographs could be connected to tragic stories of educational exclusion, childhood death, or family circumstances that had prevented formal school enrollment. The spiritual manifestations in school photography appeared to document a hidden epidemic of children whose desire for education had been thwarted by poverty, discrimination, illness, or social circumstances beyond their control. One of the most compelling cases involved a 1888 class photograph from a rural Oklahoma school that showed 32 enrolled students plus 3 additional children who appeared as translucent figures standing behind the main group. Dr. Patterson's research had identified these figures as Native American children who had been prohibited from attending the white-only school despite living in the same community and desperately wanting to participate in formal education. The 3 children had all died during a measles outbreak in the winter of 1887, just months before the class photograph was taken. According to tribal oral histories that Dr. Patterson had documented, the children had often stood outside the school windows during class sessions, trying to learn by listening to lessons they were forbidden to attend. The appearance of these excluded children in the school photograph created a powerful visual testament to the educational injustices that had characterized American education during the late 19th century, when racial discrimination, economic barriers, and social prejudices had denied countless children access to learning opportunities. Dr. Clark worked with Dr. Patterson to develop a comprehensive database of mysterious school photography cases, creating systematic documentation that would allow for statistical analysis of the phenomena and identification of patterns that might reveal the underlying causes and mechanisms involved in spiritual manifestations in educational settings. Their collaborative research revealed that spiritual appearances in school photography were not random occurrences, but followed specific patterns related to educational exclusion, childhood trauma, and community guilt about denying educational opportunities to children who desperately wanted to learn. Schools that had histories of exclusionary practices based on race, poverty, immigration status, or religious differences showed significantly higher rates of mysterious additional figures appearing in their historical photographs. The spiritual manifestations appeared to be directly correlated with the intensity of desire for education among excluded children and the level of community awareness about educational injustices. The most dramatic cases involved schools where multiple children had died after being denied educational opportunities, creating what researchers began to term educational trauma clusters that persisted in spiritual form within school environments. These clusters often manifested in school photography for decades after the original tragedies, suggesting that the spiritual presence of excluded children could become permanent aspects of educational institutions. Dr. Morrison expanded her folklorist research to include international examples of educational exclusion and spiritual manifestation, working with colleagues in Europe, Asia, and Africa to document similar phenomena in different cultural contexts. Her research revealed that spiritual appearances in school photography represented universal human responses to educational injustice, rather than cultural artifacts specific to American or Victorian contexts. Schools in rural Ireland showed similar patterns during the 19th century period, when Catholic children were forbidden from attending Protestant schools, with numerous photographs documenting the spiritual presence of children who had died without access to formal education. Industrial schools in England during the same period had produced photographs showing additional children who could be identified as former students who had died from malnutrition, disease, or abuse while in institutional care. These spiritual manifestations appeared to represent ongoing connections between deceased children and the educational environments where they had suffered or been denied opportunities. The international scope of educational spiritual photography revealed that the phenomena documented in American schools represented part of a global pattern of spiritual response to educational injustice that transcended national boundaries, cultural differences, and religious traditions. Dr. Foster's technical analysis had meanwhile evolved to include advanced digital enhancement techniques that could reveal previously invisible details in historical school photographs. Her work with computer-enhanced imaging had uncovered dozens of additional mysterious figures that had been too faint to detect through traditional photographic analysis. The enhanced imaging revealed that spiritual manifestations in school photography were far more common than previously realized, with subtle additional figures appearing in nearly every school photograph that Dr. Foster examined from institutions with histories of educational exclusion or childhood trauma. Most significantly, the computer enhancement revealed that many of the mysterious figures showed evidence of interaction with living students, including hand-holding, shared positioning, and facial expressions that suggested awareness of and response to their living classmates. These interactions provided evidence that spiritual manifestations in school photography represented more than simple visual recordings of deceased children. They documented ongoing spiritual relationships between living and dead children that persisted within educational environments. The enhanced imaging also revealed written messages and symbols that appeared faintly in the backgrounds of some school photographs, apparently created by spiritual presence rather than human hands. These messages often consisted of single words like remember, include, or learn, suggesting that the spiritual manifestations were attempting to communicate specific messages about educational justice and inclusion. Dr. Clark collaborated with Dr. Patricia Whitfield, a child psychologist at Harvard Medical School who specialized in educational trauma and its long-term psychological impacts. Dr. Whitfield's research focused on understanding how exclusion from educational opportunities could create psychological wounds that might persist beyond individual lifetimes and influence entire educational communities. According to Dr. Whitfield's analysis, schools that had histories of excluding children based on arbitrary or discriminatory criteria often developed what she termed institutional guilt syndrome, a collective psychological condition that could persist for generations and manifest in various ways, including spiritual phenomena, unexplained educational difficulties, and ongoing problems with student inclusion and community cohesion. The spiritual manifestations in school photography appeared to represent one way that institutional guilt syndrome expressed itself, creating visual reminders of historical injustices that demanded acknowledgement and resolution. Schools that had addressed their histories of educational exclusion through memorial services, policy changes, or community reconciliation efforts showed decreased rates of mysterious figures appearing in contemporary photographs. Dr. Whitfield's therapeutic work with modern schools that had discovered spiritual manifestations in their historical photographs had revealed that acknowledging and honoring the memories of excluded children could have significant positive impacts on current educational communities, improving student morale, teacher satisfaction, and overall institutional effectiveness. The research had practical implications for understanding how historical educational injustices could continue to influence contemporary school environments, and how addressing these historical traumas could improve current educational outcomes for all students. Dr. Clark's investigation had attracted attention from the United States Department of Education, which commissioned a comprehensive study of historical educational exclusion and its ongoing impacts on American school systems. The study would use spiritual manifestations in school photography as one indicator of historical trauma that required acknowledgement and remediation. The federal study revealed that thousands of American schools had histories of systematic exclusion based on race, ethnicity, religion, economic status, disability, or other characteristics that had denied educational opportunities to countless children throughout American history. Many of these schools continued to struggle with achievement gaps, discipline disparities, and community tensions that could be traced directly to their histories of exclusionary practices and the unresolved trauma associated with denying education to children who desperately wanted to learn. The spiritual photography evidence provided compelling documentation of the long-term impacts of educational injustice, creating visual proof that the consequences of excluding children from learning opportunities could persist for generations and continue to influence educational environments decades or centuries after the original exclusion occurred. Margaret Thornfield had meanwhile established the Lucy Whitmore Foundation for Educational Inclusion, creating a national organization dedicated to researching historical educational exclusion and developing programs to address the ongoing impacts of educational trauma in contemporary school communities. The Foundation's work included creating memorial programs for children who had been excluded from educational opportunities, developing curricula that taught about historical educational injustices, and providing support for schools that wanted to address their own histories of exclusionary practices. The Foundation had also created a national archive of spiritual school photography, documenting hundreds of cases where deceased children had appeared in school photographs and working to identify the historical circumstances that had led to their educational exclusion. This archive had become an invaluable resource for researchers, educators, and community members who wanted to understand the hidden histories of educational injustice and work toward creating more inclusive educational environments for contemporary children. The Lucy Whitmore Foundation had also developed partnerships with Native American tribes, immigrant communities, and other groups that had historically been excluded from educational opportunities, creating collaborative programs that honored the memories of excluded children while working to prevent similar injustices in contemporary educational settings. Dr. Clark's research had evolved into a comprehensive investigation of the relationship between education, social justice, and spiritual experience that had implications far beyond the specific case of the Millbrook class photograph. His work had revealed that education represented such a fundamental human need that the desire for learning could persist beyond death and manifest in ways that challenged conventional understanding of consciousness, spiritual experience, and the relationship between individual trauma and institutional environments. The investigation had also demonstrated the power of photographic technology to document aspects of human experience that exceeded normal perception, providing visual evidence for spiritual phenomena that might otherwise be dismissed as imagination or folklore. Contemporary applications of the research had begun to influence educational policy at both state and federal levels, with new guidelines requiring schools to acknowledge and address their histories of educational exclusion as part of creating more inclusive and effective learning environments. Teacher training programs had begun incorporating information about historical educational trauma and its ongoing impacts, helping educators understand how past injustices could continue to influence present-day school communities and student outcomes. The research had also influenced therapeutic approaches for working with children who experienced educational exclusion or discrimination, providing historical context that helped contemporary educators and mental health professionals understand the long-term impacts of denying educational opportunities to children who desperately wanted to learn. Dr. Foster's photographic analysis had expanded to include contemporary school photography, investigating whether modern educational institutions continued to show spiritual manifestations associated with excluded or marginalized students. Her preliminary findings suggested that spiritual phenomena in school photography persisted in modern educational environments, particularly in schools with ongoing problems related to achievement gaps, disciplinary disparities, or community tensions that reflected unresolved historical traumas. Modern digital photography appeared to be even more sensitive than Victorian-era chemical processes to spiritual manifestations, with computer enhancement revealing subtle additional figures in contemporary school photographs, from institutions with histories of educational exclusion or ongoing problems with student marginalization. The continuity between historical and contemporary spiritual school photography provided evidence that the underlying mechanisms involved in these phenomena represented ongoing aspects of human consciousness and educational experience, rather than artifacts of particular historical periods or photographic technologies. International collaboration on educational spiritual photography had expanded to include researchers from universities and cultural institutions around the world, creating a global database of documented cases that revealed the universal nature of spiritual responses to educational injustice. The database included examples from every continent and from educational institutions, representing diverse cultural, religious, and economic contexts, demonstrating that the phenomena documented in American Victorian schools represented fundamental aspects of human consciousness and spiritual experience that transcended cultural boundaries. The research had established educational spiritual photography as a legitimate field of academic inquiry, with implications for understanding consciousness, social justice, educational effectiveness, and the relationship between historical trauma and contemporary institutional performance. Dr. Clark had founded the International Institute for Educational Spiritual Research, creating a permanent organization dedicated to investigating and documenting spiritual phenomena in educational settings, while working to address the historical injustices that appeared to create conditions conducive to such manifestations. The Institute maintained the world's largest collection of educational spiritual photography, provided resources for schools wanting to address their histories of exclusionary practices, and conducted ongoing research into the relationship between educational justice and spiritual experience. The Millbrook class photograph that had initiated the entire investigation remained the most thoroughly documented and frequently cited example of educational spiritual photography, serving as a symbol of both the tragedy of educational exclusion and the persistent human desire for learning and inclusion that could transcend even death. Lucy Whitmore's blurred but unmistakable presence in the 1891 class photograph continued to remind viewers that some human needs were so fundamental that they could overcome any obstacle, including the barriers that seemed to separate the living from the dead. The photograph had become an icon representing the importance of educational inclusion and the responsibility of educational institutions to recognize and serve all children who desired learning opportunities, regardless of their official enrollment status or ability to pay for formal education. As research into educational spiritual photography continued, Lucy Whitmore's story served as a powerful reminder that the consequences of educational exclusion could persist far beyond the immediate impacts on individual children and families, influencing entire educational communities for generations, and creating spiritual legacies that demanded acknowledgement and resolution. The 1891 class photograph from Millbrook Elementary School had evolved from a mysterious historical curiosity into a catalyst for social justice, educational reform, and spiritual understanding that had transformed how educators, policymakers, and communities understood the relationship between education, inclusion, and human dignity. Margaret Thornfield's dedication to preserving and investigating the photograph had helped reveal not only Lucy Whitmore's individual story, but also the broader patterns of educational injustice that had characterized American education for generations, creating opportunities for acknowledgement, healing, and positive change in contemporary educational communities. The extra child in the back row of the class photograph would forever serve as a testament to the enduring power of the human desire for education and the responsibility of educational institutions to ensure that no child's longing for learning and inclusion would ever again be denied or forgotten. Dr. Clark's investigation had demonstrated that some aspects of human experience were so fundamental that they could persist beyond physical death, creating spiritual legacies that challenged communities to address historical injustices and work toward more equitable and inclusive educational opportunities for all children. The blurred figure of Lucy Whitmore continued to sit among her peers in the faded class photograph, finally achieving the educational inclusion that had been denied to her during her brief physical existence, while serving as an eternal reminder that every child's desire for learning deserved recognition, respect, and fulfillment within educational communities dedicated to human development and social justice. The impact of Dr. Clark's research extended far beyond academic circles, when the investigation caught the attention of documentary filmmaker Maria Santos, whose award-winning work had previously focused on social justice issues and historical injustices. Santos contacted Dr. Clark with a proposal to create a comprehensive documentary film that would bring the story of Lucy Whitmore and educational spiritual photography to a broader public audience. The documentary project, titled Invisible Students: The Spiritual Legacy of Educational Exclusion, would become one of the most influential educational justice films of the decade, screening at film festivals worldwide and ultimately being acquired by major streaming platforms for global distribution. Santos spent 18 months working with Dr. Clark and his research team, traveling to schools across the United States to document additional cases of spiritual manifestations in educational photography, while interviewing educators, historians, and community members who had been affected by discoveries of mysterious figures in their own institutional photographs. The film revealed the emotional and psychological impacts that discoveries of spiritual school photography had on contemporary educational communities. Teachers and administrators who learned that their schools had histories of educational exclusion often experienced complex feelings of guilt, responsibility, and determination to address historical injustices through improved contemporary practices. Students who learned about excluded children from their school's past frequently developed enhanced empathy and commitment to inclusion that transformed school cultures and improved outcomes for marginalized students in their own educational communities. The documentary also explored the technical and scientific aspects of spiritual photography, featuring interviews with Dr. Foster and other photographic experts who explained how Victorian-era cameras and chemical processes might have been capable of capturing spiritual manifestations that exceeded normal human perception. Computer enhancement demonstrations showed audiences exactly how mysterious figures could be revealed in historical photographs, making the scientific evidence accessible to viewers who might otherwise be skeptical about claims of supernatural phenomena in educational settings. The film's most powerful segments featured interviews with descendants of excluded children who had appeared in spiritual school photography. These family members shared stories that had been passed down through generations about ancestors who had desperately wanted educational opportunities but had been denied access due to poverty, discrimination, or social circumstances beyond their control. Many of these families had never understood the full significance of their ancestors' educational exclusion until the spiritual photography research provided context and validation for family stories about children who had died heartbroken over being unable to attend school. The documentary's international segments revealed the global scope of educational spiritual photography, with examples from schools in Ireland, India, South Africa, and other countries where historical educational policies had excluded children based on race, religion, caste, or economic status. Each international case provided cultural context that helped viewers understand how educational exclusion had been a worldwide problem that transcended national boundaries and cultural differences, while also showing how spiritual manifestations in school photography appear to represent universal human responses to educational injustice. The film's release generated significant media attention and public discussion about historical educational injustices and their ongoing impacts on contemporary school systems. Educational policymakers, school boards, and administrator organizations began incorporating the film into professional development programs designed to help educators understand and address historical trauma in their institutions. The documentary also sparked grassroots movements in communities across the United States, with local historians, parent groups, and student organizations working to research their own schools' histories and identify cases where children had been excluded from educational opportunities. These community-based investigations led to the discovery of hundreds of additional cases of educational exclusion and spiritual manifestation in school photography, dramatically expanding the documented evidence for the phenomena and creating opportunities for local communities to address their own histories of educational injustice. Dr. Clark found himself traveling constantly to speak at conferences, workshops, and community meetings, where educators and community members wanted to learn about educational spiritual photography and its implications for understanding and improving contemporary educational practices. His presentations revealed that spiritual manifestations in school photography were just one indicator of broader patterns of historical educational trauma that continued to influence school effectiveness, student outcomes, and community relationships in ways that were often unrecognized but measurable through careful analysis. Schools that acknowledged and addressed their histories of educational exclusion through memorial programs, policy changes, and community engagement consistently showed improvements in student achievement, teacher retention, and overall institutional effectiveness compared to similar schools that ignored or denied their exclusionary histories. The correlation between historical acknowledgement and contemporary performance provided compelling evidence that addressing spiritual and emotional legacies of educational injustice could have practical benefits for current educational communities. Dr. Whitfield's psychological research had meanwhile expanded to include longitudinal studies of schools that had discovered spiritual manifestations in their historical photographs, tracking changes in institutional culture, student outcomes, and community relationships over multiple years following the discoveries. Her research revealed that schools went through predictable stages in responding to discoveries of spiritual photography: initial shock and disbelief, followed by investigation and verification, then community discussion and debate, and finally acknowledgement and action to address historical injustices. Schools that progressed through all stages of this process showed the most significant improvements in contemporary educational outcomes, while schools that became stuck in denial or debate phases continued to struggle with problems that could be traced to their unresolved historical traumas. The psychological framework that Dr. Whitfield developed for understanding institutional responses to spiritual photography discoveries became widely adopted by educational consultants, school improvement specialists, and community organizers working to help schools address historical injustices. Her work had practical applications for any educational institution that wanted to understand how historical trauma might be influencing contemporary performance and relationships, providing tools for assessment, intervention, and positive change that could benefit entire educational communities. The Lucy Whitmore Foundation had meanwhile expanded its programs to include direct support for communities that had discovered spiritual manifestations in their school photography, providing resources for research, community engagement, and institutional change processes designed to address historical educational trauma. The Foundation's community support programs had helped dozens of school districts research their histories, acknowledge past injustices, and implement changes designed to prevent similar exclusion from occurring in contemporary educational settings. These programs included professional development for educators, curriculum development that taught about historical educational injustices, memorial programs that honored excluded children, and policy changes that strengthened commitments to educational inclusion and equity. The Foundation also provided grants for communities that wanted to create permanent memorials or educational programs, honoring children who had been excluded from educational opportunities, helping ensure that their stories would be remembered and their sacrifices would contribute to improved educational justice for future generations. Margaret Thornfield had become a nationally recognized advocate for educational inclusion, speaking at conferences and legislative hearings about the importance of acknowledging historical educational injustices and their ongoing impacts on contemporary school communities. Her presentations combined emotional storytelling about Lucy Whitmore and other excluded children, with practical information about how communities could research their own educational histories and take action to address historical trauma and prevent contemporary exclusion. Margaret's advocacy work had contributed to legislative changes in several states that required schools to research and acknowledge their histories of educational exclusion as part of school improvement planning and community engagement processes. These legislative requirements created systematic opportunities for schools and communities to discover and address historical educational trauma, potentially preventing the accumulation of spiritual and emotional legacies that could negatively influence educational effectiveness for generations. The International Institute for Educational Spiritual Research had established partnerships with universities around the world, creating collaborative research programs that investigated spiritual phenomena in educational settings while working to understand and address the historical injustices that appeared to create conditions conducive to such manifestations. The Institute's research had expanded beyond photography to include other forms of spiritual manifestation in educational settings, including unexplained sounds, temperature variations, electromagnetic anomalies, and reports of spiritual encounters by students, teachers, and staff members. These additional forms of spiritual activity often correlated with photographic manifestations, suggesting that excluded children might be attempting to communicate through multiple sensory channels rather than limiting their spiritual presence to visual phenomena alone. The Institute had developed protocols for documenting and investigating all forms of educational spiritual activity, creating comprehensive approaches for understanding and addressing the spiritual legacies of historical educational trauma. Dr. Clark's research had also attracted attention from neuroscientists and consciousness researchers who were interested in the implications of educational spiritual photography for understanding human consciousness, perception, and the possibility of survival after physical death. Brain imaging studies of individuals who reported spiritual encounters in educational settings revealed consistent patterns of neural activity that suggested genuine perception of information or presences that exceeded normal sensory capabilities. These neurological findings provided scientific validation for subjective reports of spiritual experiences in schools, helping to legitimize the field of educational spiritual research and attract additional academic and institutional support for continued investigation. The neuroscience research also revealed that individuals who had positive spiritual experiences in educational settings showed enhanced empathy, increased commitment to social justice, and improved psychological well-being compared to control groups, suggesting that spiritual encounters with excluded children might have beneficial effects on living educational community members. The therapeutic implications of educational spiritual research had begun to influence treatment approaches for individuals who had experienced educational trauma, exclusion, or discrimination during their own school years. Mental health professionals had developed new therapeutic techniques that incorporated awareness of historical educational injustices and their spiritual legacies, helping clients understand their own educational experiences within broader contexts of institutional trauma and social justice. These therapeutic approaches had proven particularly effective for individuals from historically marginalized communities who had experienced educational discrimination or exclusion, providing frameworks for understanding and healing from educational trauma, while connecting personal experiences to broader patterns of social injustice. The research had also influenced approaches to educational policy development, with government agencies and legislative bodies beginning to consider the spiritual and emotional legacies of historical educational policies when designing contemporary educational reforms and improvement initiatives. Policymakers had begun to recognize that educational effectiveness could be significantly influenced by unresolved historical trauma, and that addressing such trauma might be necessary for achieving sustainable improvements in educational outcomes and community relationships. Contemporary educational initiatives increasingly incorporated acknowledgement of historical injustices, memorial programs for excluded children, and explicit commitments to preventing similar exclusion in current educational practices. Dr. Foster's photographic research had meanwhile evolved to include development of new imaging technologies specifically designed to detect and document spiritual manifestations in contemporary educational settings. Her experimental equipment combined advanced digital sensors with electromagnetic field detectors, infrared imaging systems, and computer enhancement algorithms that could reveal subtle visual phenomena that might be associated with spiritual presence in schools. Field testing of these technologies in schools with histories of educational exclusion had produced remarkable results, with clear documentation of spiritual manifestations that appeared to interact with contemporary students and educational activities. The new imaging technologies provided real-time evidence for ongoing spiritual activity in educational settings, demonstrating that the phenomena documented in historical photography continued to occur in modern educational environments under appropriate conditions. Most significantly, the advanced imaging revealed that spiritual manifestations in schools appeared to respond to efforts to address historical injustices, becoming more visible and active when communities acknowledged excluded children and worked to prevent similar exclusion in contemporary settings. This responsiveness suggested that spiritual presences in educational settings were not simply passive recordings of past trauma, but active participants in ongoing educational communities who supported efforts to create more inclusive and just educational environments. The implications of responsive spiritual activity in schools challenged conventional understanding of consciousness, death, and the relationship between historical trauma and contemporary institutional performance, suggesting that addressing injustices from the past might be necessary for optimizing present and future educational effectiveness. As the research entered its second decade, Dr. Clark reflected on how Margaret Thornfield's discovery of Lucy Whitmore in the 1891 Millbrook class photograph had catalyzed a transformation in understanding educational justice, spiritual experience, and the ongoing responsibilities that educational communities had to all children who desired learning opportunities. The investigation had revealed that some human needs were so fundamental that they could persist beyond physical death, creating spiritual legacies that demanded recognition and action from living communities committed to educational equity and social justice. Lucy Whitmore's presence in the class photograph had evolved from a mysterious anomaly into a powerful symbol of the importance of educational inclusion and the enduring consequences of denying children access to learning opportunities they desperately wanted to embrace. The research had demonstrated that educational institutions carried responsibilities that extended beyond their current enrollment lists to include acknowledgement of and service to all children who had ever been excluded from educational opportunities, regardless of when such exclusion had occurred or what circumstances had created the barriers to learning. The spiritual manifestations documented in educational photography around the world provided evidence that the bonds between children and learning communities could transcend the apparent limitations of time, death, and physical presence, creating ongoing relationships that influenced educational effectiveness across generations. Dr. Clark's work had established that addressing historical educational trauma was not simply a matter of social justice or historical accuracy, but a practical necessity for optimizing contemporary educational performance and creating healthy, effective learning environments for current and future students. The 1891 class photograph from Millbrook Elementary School would forever serve as a foundational document in the field of educational spiritual research, providing visual proof that some aspects of human experience were powerful enough to overcome any obstacle, including the barriers that seem to separate the living from the dead. Margaret Thornfield's dedication to preserving and investigating the photograph had helped create a global movement for educational justice that honored the memories of excluded children while working to ensure that no contemporary child would experience the educational exclusion that had characterized so much of educational history. Lucy Whitmore's blurred but unmistakable figure in the back row of the class photograph continued to remind viewers that the desire for education and inclusion represented essential human needs that deserved recognition, respect, and fulfillment within educational communities committed to serving all children who longed to learn and belong. The extra child who had appeared in the 1891 photograph had become an eternal advocate for educational justice, proving that some connections to learning and community could persist in forms that transcended the normal limitations of physical existence, while creating ongoing opportunities for positive change in educational policy, practice, and community relationships. As researchers continued to investigate educational spiritual photography and its implications for understanding consciousness, social justice, and institutional effectiveness, Lucy Whitmore's story served as a powerful reminder that the consequences of educational exclusion could extend far beyond immediate impacts on individual children, influencing entire educational communities for generations and creating spiritual legacies that demanded acknowledgement, understanding, and transformative action from all who were committed to educational equity and human dignity.